What if Oberyn Martell won? Not just won, killed. Killed the mountain that rides. Killed the man who had raped his sister, murdered her children, crushed her skull. Killed him in front of the court, in front of Tywin Lannister, in front of the woman who had ordered the trial and the dwarf whose life hung on the outcome. That was the plan. That was always the plan. The trial by combat was never about Tyrion Lannister's innocence, not for Oberyn. Tyrion's innocence was the vehicle. The destination was Gregor Clegane's blood on the sand of the arena, and a confession ripped from his dying mouth, loud enough for the court to hear it and for history to record it. In another telling, Oberyn gets close. He gets everything he wants. The mountain on his back, the spear in his chest, the confession forming on those ruined lips. And then he gets careless. He gets close enough to look into Clegane's eyes and demand the words, and the mountain's hand finds his face, and the red viper of Dorne dies with his skull in pieces on the floor of the arena. Close. The cruelest distance in the world. The distance between almost and did. But what if the distance closed? What if Oberyn Martell, who was a showman but not a fool, who had poisoned the spear because he was Dornish, and the Dornish did not trust single points of failure? What if, in the critical moment, the moment where rage pulled him forward and the need to hear the words overrode the tactical sense that had kept him alive through 30 years of being the most dangerous man in a kingdom full of dangerous men? What if he kept his distance? What if he took the confession from 3 feet away instead of 3 inches? What if the Red Viper was everything the song said he was? Fast, brilliant, lethal, and, for one crucial heartbeat, patient. This is the story of what patience produced. The arena, King's Landing, 300 AC. The mountain was on his back. That was the fact. Gregor Clegane, 8 feet of murder in Lannister plate, the largest and most feared killer in the 7 kingdoms, the instrument of Tywin Lannister's will made flesh and steel, was on his back with a Dornish spear through the meat of his thigh and the poison already working, and Oberyn Martell was standing over him with the sun in his hair and blood on his hands and the specific expression of a man who had been waiting 20 years for this moment and who wasn't going to waste it. The crowd was screaming. The crowd always screamed at trials by combat. The specific sound of 1,000 people watching violence and pretending it was justice. The noise that courts made when they let steel decide what reason couldn't. The screaming was irrelevant. Oberyn had stopped hearing it 3 exchanges ago, when the mountain's greatsword had grazed his ribs and the graze had told him everything he needed to know. Clegane was slowing. The poison on the spear tip was working. Not fast. Oberyn had used a slow agent, manticore venom diluted with nightshade, because a fast poison might kill before the confession, and the confession was the point. The confession was always the point. You raped her. Oberyn circled. 3 feet, the distance that the spear required. Far enough that the mountain's hands couldn't reach, close enough that the spear could. He'd been maintaining this distance for the entire fight, the specific geometry of a man who fought with a weapon that was designed for range, and who understood that range was the only advantage worth having against an opponent whose advantage was everything else. You murdered her. Another circle. The mountain's eyes were tracking him, slower now, the poison pulling at the edges of the focus. The blood from the thigh wound was pooling beneath the armor, dark against the sand. The greatsword was still in Clegane's hand, but the hand was losing its grip, the fingers going loose the way fingers went loose when the blood pressure dropped and the body started choosing what to prioritize. You killed her children. The mountain tried to rise, got halfway. The thigh buckled. He went back down, one knee on the sand, the greatsword bracing him. The posture of a man who wasn't done but who was losing the argument with his own body. Oberyn wanted to get closer. This was the pull. The gravity of 20 years of rage, the specific magnetic force of looking at the man who had destroyed his sister and wanting to be close enough to see the light leave his eyes. The pull was enormous. The pull was the thing that, in another version of this story, killed him. He kept his distance. Not easily. Not with grace or discipline or the clinical detachment that the songs would later attribute to him. He kept his distance with the raw muscular effort of a man fighting his own desire, the same way he was fighting the mountain, by knowing where the danger was and not going toward it. 3 feet. Say her name. The mountain looked at him. The eyes. Small, deep set. The eyes of a man who had never in his life been bothered by what the eyes saw, were losing their focus. The manticore venom was working through the nervous system now, degrading the connections between what the brain wanted and what the body did. The arm with the greatsword trembled. The massive frame swayed. Say her name. And then, because the mountain was dying and because dying men did things they wouldn't do alive, because the venom was dissolving the barriers between thought and speech, the way it was dissolving the barriers between nerve and muscle, Gregor Clegane spoke. Elia! The arena went silent. Not gradually. Not the slow fade of a crowd losing interest. Instant. Total. The specific acoustic phenomenon of 1,000 people hearing something that changed the meaning of what they were watching. Oberyn Martell. Louder now. The venom pulling it out of him, or the dying pulling it out of him, or something else. Some terrible mechanism of confession that operated on the same principle as the trial itself. The gods decided, and the gods had decided that the truth would come out with the blood. He raped her. The mountain's voice was a ruin, stone grinding on stone, the voice of a man whose body was shutting down and whose mouth was the last thing functioning. I killed her children. I smashed her. Oberyn put the spear through his throat. Not because the confession was incomplete. The confession was more than complete. The arena had heard it. The court had heard it. Tywin Lannister, sitting in the gallery, had heard it. Oberyn put the spear through the mountain's throat because the mountain was still talking and because the details of what he'd done to Elia were not things that Oberyn wanted the court to hear in the mountain's voice. The details were Elia's. The details died with the man who'd inflicted them. The mountain fell. The specific fall of a very large man dying. Not quick, not clean. The body going down in stages as each system failed. The armor clanging against the sand in a series of diminishing impacts. The greatsword fell from his hand. The hand opened. The eyes stayed open, but stopped seeing. Gregor Clegane was dead. The arena held its breath. Oberyn stood over the body. His spear was embedded in the throat, and his hands were steady, not shaking, not trembling. The hands of a man who had done the thing he came to do, and who was experiencing not triumph, but completion. Completion was quieter than triumph. Completion was the sound of a door closing on a room you'd been standing in for 20 years. He looked up. At the gallery. At the faces. At Tywin Lannister, whose expression had not changed. Tywin's expression never changed in public. Tywin's expression was a mask that had been perfected over 40 years of performing the role of Tywin Lannister, and that could not be cracked by anything as small as the death of a useful tool. At Cersei, whose expression had changed. Whose face was doing the thing that Cersei's face did when reality failed to match her expectations. The specific contortion of a woman who had gambled on an outcome and lost, and who was already in real time, visible to anyone who was watching, beginning to calculate who to blame. At Tyrion, in the defendant's box, hands chained. Face. Oberyn couldn't read Tyrion's face from this distance. He didn't need to. The trial was over. The gods had spoken. The champion had won. By the laws of the 7 kingdoms. By the traditions that predated the Targaryens, and that even Tywin Lannister couldn't override without destroying the legal framework his power depended on. Tyrion Lannister was innocent. Oberyn pulled the spear from the mountain's throat, wiped it on his sleeve. The gesture was unnecessary. The spear was never going to be clean again, but the wiping was a ritual, the conclusion of something. He walked to the center of the arena. He said, "The trial is decided. Tyrion Lannister is innocent. The gods have spoken." Then he looked at Tywin again, directly, held the gaze across the 60 feet of sand and gallery. And Gregor Clegane confessed to the rape and murder of Oberyn Martell and the murder of her children. In front of this court, in front of these witnesses, the gaze held. Someone gave the order. The arena erupted. The aftermath, the first hour. Tyrion was released within the hour. Not gracefully. Nothing in King's Landing was done gracefully. The jailers had to be ordered by the Hands Office, then counter-ordered by the Crown, then reordered by the judges of the trial, and the bureaucratic chaos of a legal system trying to process a verdict it hadn't expected produced exactly the kind of delayed, confused, grudging liberation that Tyrion had expected, and that he endured with the patience of a man who had spent most of his life enduring things that should have been simpler than they were. They brought him his clothes. Not the good ones. The clothes he'd been arrested in, stained and creased and carrying the specific stale smell of fabric that had been stored in a cell for weeks. He put them on. He was smaller in them than he'd been when he took them off, the weight loss of the trial visible in the looseness of the fabric. He went to find Oberyn. Not to thank him. Tyrion understood that thanking Oberyn would misread the transaction. Oberyn had not fought for Tyrion. Oberyn had fought for Elia, and Tyrion's life had been the currency that bought Oberyn access to the arena. Thanking someone for using you as a tool was a misunderstanding of the relationship, and Tyrion did not misunderstand relationships. He understood them with the specific clarity of a man who had spent his life on the outside of most relationships and who had developed, through the exclusion, an observational precision that the people inside the relationships rarely matched. He found Oberyn in the rooms the Martells had been given in the Red Keep. The rooms were full. Dornish retainers, sand snakes, the elder three, who had come north with their father, a maester attending to a cut on Oberyn's forearm that Oberyn was ignoring with the specific Dornish disregard for minor injuries that Tyrion found both impressive and medically irresponsible. Prince Oberyn. Lord Tyrion. Oberyn looked at him. Dark eyes, dark hair slicked with sweat that was drying in the afternoon heat. The face of a man who had just killed someone he'd been dreaming about killing for 20 years, and who was navigating the specific emotional terrain of post-completion. The discovery that the thing you'd been wanting was smaller than the wanting, and that the space the wanting had occupied was now empty and needed filling. You're free. I am. Because of you. Because of Clegane's confession. I was merely the instrument. An instrument that put a spear through a man's throat. Through several parts of a man, actually. The throat was the finale. Oberyn waved the Maester away from his arm. Sit. Drink. You look like a man who needs both. Tyrion sat. Drank. The wine was Dornish. Strong, red, carrying the heat of the south in the way that Dornish wine did. The taste of a place that operated by different rules and that had produced the man sitting across from him. You got the confession. I did. The entire court heard it. The entire court heard a dying man say words that everyone already knew were true, and that nobody wanted to acknowledge, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging who gave the order. Oberyn's voice was even, controlled. The specific control of a man who was choosing each word the way he chose each thrust of the spear, deliberately, with awareness of where the point was going and what it would produce when it arrived. The confession changes nothing if the man who gave the order is untouched. You mean my father? I mean the hand of the king. I mean the Lord of Casterly Rock. I mean the man who sat in that gallery today and watched his creature die and whose face did not change. Oberyn drank. I have spent 20 years waiting to hear Clegane say my sister's name. He said it. He is dead. That was the first part. He held Tyrion's gaze. There are other parts. Tyrion sat with this. He thought about his father, about Tywin's face in the gallery, the mask, the control, the absolute refusal to acknowledge that anything had happened that mattered. Tywin's face said, "A tool has been broken. I will acquire another tool." Tywin's face said, "The dwarf is free. This is an inconvenience, not a defeat." Tywin's face said nothing about Oberyn Martell. "The other parts," Tyrion said, "what do they involve?" Justice, for Elia, for her children, not the justice of the arena. That was vengeance. Vengeance and justice are not the same thing, although the Dornish enjoy both. Oberyn leaned forward. The confession was heard. The confession implicates the man who gave the order. The question is whether this court, this king, this council, has the spine to follow the implication to its conclusion. The answer is no. I know the answer is no. I ask the question anyway, because the asking changes the politics even when the answer doesn't change. Oberyn smiled. Not warm, sharp. The smile of a viper that had bitten and was watching the venom work. Your father cannot unheard what the court heard today. He cannot make the confession disappear. He can suppress it, deny it, redirect it. But the words were spoken, and the witnesses exist, and Dorne's memory is longer than Lannister gold. Tyrion drank his wine. He thought, I am free because this man killed the mountain. I am also free in a city where my father tried to execute me. My sister accused me of murder, and the woman I loved testified against me. Freedom, in this context, is a concept with several asterisks. What are you going to do now? Tyrion asked. Stay, for the moment. Oberyn looked at the ceiling. King's Landing in summer is terrible. The heat, the smell, the specific way that 500,000 people generate a miasma that I find personally offensive. But the politics are interesting. Your sister is furious. Your father is calculating. The Tyrells are watching. And I am here, alive, with a confession that implicates the hand of the king in the murder of a princess. He looked at Tyrion. Interesting is an understatement. Be careful. Careful is for men who have something to lose. You have 8 daughters. Oberyn's face changed. Not dramatically. A shift. The mask of the showman adjusting to accommodate the father, the man underneath the performance. 8 daughters, he said, and a brother in Sunspear who has been patient for 20 years and who is, I suspect, less patient than he appears. He stood. Go, Lord Tyrion. Find yourself a bath and a meal and whatever passes for safety in this city. We'll talk again. Tyrion left. He walked through the corridors of the Red Keep with the specific, uncomfortable freedom of a man who had been in a cell an hour ago and who was now in a castle that contained his father, his sister, and a Dornish prince who had just killed the most dangerous man in the 7 Kingdoms and who was looking at Tywin Lannister the way a snake looked at a mouse. He needed to think. He needed to think very quickly and very clearly because the chessboard had just been upended and the pieces were still in the air, and whoever read the new positions fastest would have the advantage when the pieces landed. He went to find Bronn. Tywin, the Tower of the Hand. 300 AC. Tywin Lannister did not go to the arena. After the fight, after the confession, after the verdict, after the eruption of the crowd, and the specific political detonation that Oberyn Martell had engineered with the precision of a man who understood that a trial by combat was not a duel, but a performance. Tywin went to the Tower of the Hand. He walked. He did not hurry. The corridors of the Red Keep were full of people talking about what had just happened, and Tywin walked through them the way he walked through everything, without acknowledging that the thing happening around him was worth his attention. He reached the tower. He closed the door. He sat at the desk. He sat for 11 minutes. This was unusual. Tywin Lannister did not sit without working. Tywin Lannister processed information the way a siege engine processed walls, immediately, with force, converting input into action without the intermediate step of reflection. 11 minutes of sitting was Tywin's version of crisis. The mountain was dead. This was a loss. Not an emotional loss. Tywin was not sentimental about Gregor Clegane the way a man was sentimental about a person. Clegane was a tool. The best tool of a specific kind, the kind that destroyed things on command without hesitation or conscience. Losing the tool was an inconvenience. Tools could be replaced. The confession was not a loss. The confession was a catastrophe. Tywin had spent 20 years managing the narrative of Elia Martell's death. Not denying it. Denial would have been futile and, more importantly, unnecessary. The realm knew Clegane had killed Elia. The realm had always known. The question that Tywin had managed for 20 years was not, did it happen, but who ordered it? And the management had been spectacularly effective because the question had never been asked in public by anyone with the standing to force an answer. The confession had changed that. Clegane had not named Tywin. The confession was, I raped her. I killed her children. Not, Tywin Lannister ordered me to rape her and kill her children. The gap between what Clegane said and what the court inferred was the gap that Tywin would have to operate in for the rest of this crisis. The gap between spoken and implied, between what could be proven and what everyone knew. Everyone knew. That was the problem. Not the legal problem. Legally, Tywin was untouchable. No confession had named him. No evidence existed in document or testimony. The legal architecture was intact. The political architecture was not. The political architecture was the structure of relationships and alliances and unspoken understandings that held the realm together. And the political architecture was built on the assumption that certain things, certain ugly, necessary things that happened during wars, were not discussed in public. Oberyn Martell had discussed them in public, loudly, in an arena, in front of the court. Tywin made a list. This was what Tywin did in crisis. He made lists, not on paper, in his head. The list of what needed to happen, in what order, to convert a catastrophe into a manageable problem. First, the narrative. The confession needed to be reframed, not denied. Reframing was more effective than denial, because denial invited examination, and examination was what Tywin could not afford. The reframe was, Clegane acted alone. The sack of King's Landing was chaos. In chaos, men did terrible things without orders. The Mountain was a known brute. The confession confirmed his brutality, not his chain of command. Second, the Martells. Oberyn was in King's Landing with a confession that implicated the hand of the king and the political leverage to use it. Oberyn needed to be either satisfied or neutralized. Satisfied meant giving Dorne something it wanted, more than it wanted Tywin's head. Neutralized meant Tywin considered this carefully. Neutralized meant something that could not look like neutralization, because neutralizing a Prince of Dorne in the current political climate would start a war that Tywin did not want. Third, Tyrion. The dwarf was free. The trial had failed. Cersei's strategy, the accusation, the witnesses, the champion, had collapsed, and the collapse had produced not only Tyrion's freedom, but also the confession that was now the primary political crisis. Cersei had created this situation. The fact that she had created it with Tywin's tacit permission did not reduce Tywin's fury about the outcome. Fourth, the Tyrells. Olenna Tyrell was in King's Landing. Olenna Tyrell had watched the trial. Olenna Tyrell was the most dangerous political mind in the realm besides Tywin's own, and Olenna Tyrell was currently recalculating the Tyrell position based on the fact that the hand of the king had just been implicated, publicly, audibly, in front of witnesses, in the murder of a Dornish princess. Tywin picked up a quill. He began to write, not letters, a strategy, the specific line-by-line construction of a response to a crisis that had multiple fronts and that required coordinated action across all of them simultaneously. He worked for 3 hours. Then Cersei arrived. Cersei. What fury produced? 300 AC. She came through the door without knocking. This was Cersei in crisis. The protocols stripped away, the performance of queenly composure discarded in favor of the raw machinery underneath. She was wearing the gown she'd worn to the trial, and her hair was slightly disordered, and her eyes had the specific bright heat of a woman whose control was not so much lost as redirected, aimed like a weapon at whoever was in range. "He's free." Tywin didn't look up from his papers. "I know. The dwarf is free, walking the corridors, in the Red Keep. The man who murdered my son is the man who was acquitted of murdering your son, by trial, by combat, under the laws of the 7 kingdoms that you invoked when you arranged the trial. I didn't. You arranged the trial, Cersei. You selected the accusation. You produced the witnesses. You chose the champion. Every element of the strategy was yours, and every element failed." Cersei's face went through something. Not hurt. She was beyond hurt. Rage. The specific Cersei rage that burned hot enough to consume the person feeling it, along with everything around them. The Dornish Viper. 1. By the rules you agreed to, the gods have spoken, as the tradition requires. The verdict is legally binding and cannot be overturned without destroying the legal framework that holds the crown's authority in place. Tywin looked at her. "Sit down." "I don't want to." "Sit down." She sat. Not because she wanted to, because Tywin's voice had the quality that his voice had when the conversation was not optional, and Cersei, despite everything, despite the fury and the grief and the specific combustion that was happening inside her, was still Tywin Lannister's daughter, and Tywin Lannister's daughter sat when Tywin Lannister told her to sit. "The trial is over," Tywin said. "The verdict is decided. Tyrion is free. These are facts. They cannot be changed by volume or repetition, or the application of additional fury to an immovable situation." He held her gaze. What can be changed is what happens next. What happens next is that the imp. What happens next is that you listen. Tywin's voice was iron, not raised, lowered. The Tywin technique for communicating maximum authority. Quieter, not louder. The mountain is dead. His confession is public. Half the court heard him say your sister-in-law's name while he described what he did to her. That confession is the crisis, not Tyrion, not the verdict. The confession. What does the confession have to do with... The confession implies that I ordered the murder of Oberyn Martell and her children. It does not say so, but the implication is... He paused. The pause was itself unusual enough to register. Tywin did not pause. The implication is loud enough that every lord in the 7 kingdoms is currently revising their assessment of the Lannister position. Cersei stared at him. Did you? Order it? The sack of King's Landing was... Did you order the mountain to kill Elia and her children? Tywin's face, the mask, the 40-year mask that had been built for exactly this question, and that held exactly the way it was designed to hold. The sack of King's Landing produced casualties on all sides. War is... Father. Cersei's voice was different now. not fury. Something colder. The specific cold that happened when a Lannister turned the family intelligence inward, when the pattern recognition that they used on enemies was applied to the person sitting across from them. Did you give the order? I gave the order to take the city. The specifics of how individual soldiers interpreted that order? That's a yes. The room went very still. You gave the order. Cersei's voice was flat. Processing. The information was not surprising. She had suspected, the way everyone in the realm had suspected. But suspecting and knowing were different things. And the difference was in the weight. You ordered the murder of children and the rape of a princess, and you've been, for 20 years. I ensured that the Targaryen bloodline was eliminated from the succession, that Robert Baratheon's throne was secure, that the realm had stability. Tywin's voice was the voice he used when he was converting an atrocity into a policy statement. The method was regrettable. The outcome was necessary. The outcome is that a Dornish prince just killed the man who did it in front of the court, and now the court knows, and... Cersei stopped. Her mind was racing, visible, the gears turning behind the green Lannister eyes. The Martells. The Martells? They're going to want... what? An apology? Compensation? Your head? They're going to want justice. The question is what form of justice I can offer that satisfies Dorne without destroying the Lannister position. He picked up the quill again. Leave. Father. Leave, Cersei. You have contributed enough to this situation. She left. The door closed behind her with more force than the door required. Tywin wrote. He wrote for another hour. Then he called for Sir Keevan. Tyrion and Bronn, the night after. Bronn was drinking in the same tavern he always drank in, a place in Flea Bottom called the Rusty Nail that served ale that tasted like it had been brewed in the building's foundation, and that attracted a clientele who found the taste acceptable, which was its own kind of character reference. Tyrion sat across from him. Bronn looked at him. The look was the look Bronn always gave, appraising, calculating the value of the thing in front of him, the expression of a sellsword whose primary relationship with the world was transactional, and who made no effort to disguise this, because disguising it would have required an energy expenditure Bronn considered wasteful. You're alive. Observant as ever. I wasn't sure you would be. Bronn drank. When you asked me to be your champion, and I said no, you said no because the mountain would have killed you. The mountain would have killed me. Yes, I like money. I don't like it enough to die for it. Bronn shrugged. The Dornishman was better. The Dornishman was insane. He fought the largest man in the 7 kingdoms with a spear and a grudge. And won. And won. They drank. The ale was terrible. Tyrion drank it anyway because the alternative was sobriety, and sobriety in King's Landing after the day he'd had was not something he was willing to endure. So, Bronn said, what now? That is the question. Tyrion looked at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the stains that mapped decades of spilled ale and spilled blood and spilled lives. I'm free, legally, by verdict of trial by combat. My father can't execute me. My sister can't accuse me again. Double jeopardy. The laws are clear. But I'm free in a city where my father wants me dead. My sister wants me dead. The woman I loved testified against me, and the only person who actively worked to keep me alive is a Dornish prince who did it for his own reasons, and who is currently using my continued existence as a chess piece in a political game I don't control. That's a lot of buts. It's a considerable quantity of buts. Tyrion drank. I need to leave King's Landing. Where? That's the other question. North is. The Boltons have Winterfell. Stannis is at the Wall. The North is a catastrophe. East is Essos, which is far and expensive and requires a ship. South is Dorne, which would put me in Oberyn's orbit permanently, and while I appreciate the man's fighting skills, I don't want to be anyone's pet Lannister. West is home. Tyrion looked at him. Casterly Rock, Bronn said. Your father's seat. If your brother's in the Kingsguard and can't inherit. My father would rather burn the rock to the ground than let me sit in it. Your father just lost the mountain, lost the trial, got his name attached to the murder of a princess in front of the court, and has a Dornish prince in the city who is not going to leave until he gets what he wants. Bronn tilted his head. Your father might have bigger problems than you. Tyrion considered this. He considered it the way he considered everything, from multiple angles, with the specific intelligence that had kept him alive in a family that wanted him dead, the mind that his father considered a waste because it was housed in a body that Tywin found offensive. The mind was the best thing about him. The mind was going to have to carry him through whatever came next, because nothing else was going to. I'm not going to the Rock, Tyrion said. Not yet. I'm going to stay. Bronn raised an eyebrow. Stay in the city where everyone wants you dead. Stay in the city where everything is about to change. My father is exposed. My sister is destabilized. The Tyrells are recalculating. Oberyn is a force of nature, with a grievance and a confession, and the political skills to use both. He looked at Bronn. The game just changed. I don't know what it changed into yet, but I'd rather be in the game than outside it. You almost died in the game. I almost die in everything. That's the nature of being me. He finished the ale. Stay close. I'm going to need you. How much? What? How much are you going to need me? I charge by the risk. I know, I'll pay. You always say that. I always pay. Bronn considered this, found it acceptable, drank. The Tyrells. What Olenna calculated. 300 AC. Olenna Tyrell had been in King's Landing for 4 months, and she had hated every day of it. The heat was part of it. King's Landing in summer was an oven that smelled like fish and chamber pots, and the specific collective effluvia of 500,000 people who had not, in Olenna's assessment, sufficiently embraced the concept of drainage. But the heat was manageable. The politics were not. The politics had been, until today, a straightforward transaction. The Tyrells provided grain, men, and Margaery. The Lannisters provided the throne. The arrangement was ugly and practical and sustainable, as long as both parties kept their end, and neither party did anything so catastrophically stupid that the arrangement's foundations were undermined. The Mountain's confession was catastrophically stupid. Not Oberyn's doing. Oberyn was, in Olenna's assessment, one of the few people in the Red Keep who was operating at full capacity. The catastrophic stupidity was Cersei's, arranging a trial that created the conditions for a public confession of a crime that everyone knew about but nobody discussed, because discussing it would produce exactly the political fallout that was now, in real time, happening. Olenna was in her rooms when Margaery came. Margaery was 17, beautiful, composed, and carrying the specific expression of a young woman who had been raised for the Game of Thrones by the greatest player alive, and who was currently facing a situation that the training had not specifically covered. The confession, I heard it. I was there. Grandmother, the confession means, I know what the confession means. Sit down. Don't fret. Fretting is for people who haven't prepared. Margaery sat. She did not fret, because Olenna had spent 17 years training the fret out of her. But the impulse was there, visible in the hands, in the slight elevation of the shoulders, in the specific physical tells that Margaery could suppress in public and that emerged in private, because private was the only place she could be 17 instead of queen. The Lannister position is weakened, Olenna said. Not destroyed, weakened. Tywin will manage the confession. He'll spin it, reframe it, find a narrative that distances him from the Order. He's been managing worse than this for 40 years. But the Dornish know, the court knows, and most importantly, I know, and what I know changes the calculation. Olenna ate a cheese. The cheese was from the Reach. She refused to eat local cheese on principle. The Tyrion Lannister alliance was based on mutual benefit. The benefit was, we get the throne, they get our grain and swords. The alliance was stable, as long as the Lannisters were the strongest position available. And now there's a Dornish prince in the city with a dead mountain and a confession that makes the Lannisters vulnerable. The Dornish are, historically, enemies of the Tyrells, but they're also potential allies against a weakened Lannister position, and the game is always about who's weakened and who can exploit the weakness. You want to talk to Oberyn. I want to listen to Oberyn. Talking comes later. Listening comes first, because listening tells you what the other person wants, and what they want tells you what you can get from them. Margaery looked at her grandmother. What do we want? What we've always wanted. Margaery on the throne. A Tyrell dynasty. The specific outcome that we've been working towards since your grandfather married me off to a Tyrell, and I decided that if I was going to be a Tyrell, I was going to be the Tyrell. Olenna wiped her fingers. The method changes. The goal doesn't. And Tommen is 8 years old and sweet and entirely manageable, and will be king when Joffrey is no longer king. Olenna looked at Margaery with the specific directness that Olenna used when the conversation was about the things they didn't say aloud. Joffrey is a problem. Joffrey has been a problem since before the wedding. The question has always been timing. Margaery's face didn't change. This was the training. The specific Olenna-built architecture of composure that allowed a 17-year-old girl to hear her grandmother discuss the removal of a king without her face betraying anything that could be used against her. The timing, Margaery said, has been moved up by the confession, by the destabilization, by the specific opportunity that chaos produces for people who are prepared for chaos. Olenna stood. I'm going to take a nap. Then I'm going to invite Prince Oberyn to tea. Then we'll see what the world looks like when two of the most dangerous people in the Seven Kingdoms agree on something. What do you agree on? That Tywin Lannister has been running this kingdom for too long, and that the running has produced a specific kind of rot that the kingdom cannot sustain. She looked at Margaery. Oberyn wants justice for Elia. I want the throne for you. Those are different goals with compatible methods. She went to nap. Margaery sat in the room and thought about timing and chaos and the specific education she'd received from her grandmother over 17 years, which was, the game is played by everyone and won by the people who see the board clearly and move when the board is shifting rather than when the board is settled. The board was shifting. Margaery began to move. Oberyn and Olenna. T. 300 AC. They met in the gardens. Not by accident. Nothing involving Olenna Tyrell happened by accident. The location was chosen for its specific combination of privacy and aesthetics, the kind of place where a conversation that was going to change the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms could be conducted over tea cakes without the participants feeling that the setting was beneath the occasion. Olenna was already seated when Oberyn arrived. This was also not accidental. Arriving first was a power move that Olenna executed with the practiced ease of a woman who had been arriving first for 60 years. Prince Oberyn, how kind of you to come. Lady Olenna. Oberyn sat across from her. He was moving well. The cut on his arm from the trial had been stitched, and the fight had left him sore but functional. The specific resilience of a man who had been training his body for combat for 30 years and who recovered from violence the way musicians recovered from performances. You look well. I look ancient, but I appreciate the pretense. Olenna poured tea. I watched the trial. You watched, along with 1,000 others. The 1,000 others heard a confession. I heard a strategy. Olenna looked at him over the rim of her cup. You didn't kill the mountain for revenge. Not entirely. You killed him for the confession. The confession is the weapon. Oberyn sipped his tea. Go on. The confession implicates Tywin. Not legally. He's too careful for legal implication. But politically, publicly, in the court of opinion, which is, despite what lords pretend, the court that actually matters. She set down the cup. You've given the realm something it's never had before. Proof. Not proof that can be tried in a court. Proof that can be used in a conversation. And you want to have that conversation. I want to hear what conversation you're proposing. Oberyn looked at the garden. At the roses, Tyrell roses, planted when the Tyrells arrived. The specific botanical colonization that happened when the Reach established itself in a new location. The roses were pretty. The thorns were there. I want Tywin to answer for Elia. That won't happen. I know it won't happen in the way I'd like. His head on a spike. His legacy reduced to the words, he ordered the murder of children. That won't happen because the political structure of the realm requires Tywin alive and functional. Oberyn looked at her. What might happen is a shift, a redistribution. The Lannister stranglehold on the crown, the hand, the treasury, the military, the intelligence. That hold is based on the assumption that Tywin is untouchable. The confession touches him. You want the handship. I want it taken from him. Who gets it is negotiable. Olenna's eyes sharpened. The specific Olenna sharpness that happened when a conversation moved from posturing to substance, from the performance of diplomacy to the actual transaction underneath. A Tyrell hand. Possible. The Dornish want a seat on the small council, recognition, the specific public acknowledgement that Elia's murder was ordered by the hand of the king, and that the acknowledgement carries consequences. Oberyn leaned forward. I'm not asking for war, Lady Olenna. I'm asking for politics, for the confession to produce a political consequence that changes Dorne's position in the realm. And in exchange, Dorne's support. For whatever you're planning. He held her gaze. You're planning something. You've been planning something since you arrived in King's Landing. The Tyrell marriage to Joffrey is a tool, not a goal. No grandmother who loves her granddaughter would deliver her to that boy as a permanent arrangement. You're planning an exit. Olenna said nothing, which was, from Olenna, an answer. I don't need to know the details, Oberyn said. I need to know the timeline. Because my next moves, the confession, the political pressure, the conversation with the lords, those moves are more effective if they're coordinated with whatever you're doing. Coordinated. Olenna tasted the word. That's a more sophisticated proposal than I expected from a man who kills people with poisoned spears. I kill people with poisoned spears and sophisticated proposals. The combination is what makes me useful. Olenna looked at him. Really looked. The full weight of 60 years of political assessment. The woman who had turned a middling house into a great one through pure strategic intelligence, evaluating the man who had just killed the most feared weapon in the realm and who was now proposing an alliance over tea. Weeks, she said, not months. Weeks is acceptable. And the detail you don't need to know. You truly don't want to know it. I want to know it so badly I can taste it. But knowing it makes me complicit. And complicity is a tool I can't afford. Dorne's position must be clean. Clean. Olenna almost smiled. I haven't heard that word used in King's Landing since I arrived. That's because King's Landing is not a clean city. No. She poured more tea. No, it is not. They drank. They discussed specifics. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered the small council composition, the distribution of political appointments, the specific grievances that Dorne had carried for 20 years, and the specific concessions that might not resolve. Nothing resolved in politics, but reduce the pressure. By the end of the tea, an arrangement existed. Not written, not signed. An arrangement in the way that powerful people made arrangements, through shared understanding, through the specific telepathy of two minds that operated at the same frequency, and that could convey in a look what lesser politicians required a treaty to establish. Olenna, I'll send word. Oberyn, I'll be ready. He left the garden. Olenna sat with her tea and looked at the roses. She thought, the Dornish are useful. More useful than I expected. The man is not just a fighter, he's a strategist wearing a fighter's costume, which is more dangerous than either thing alone. She thought, Tywin is going to be very unhappy. She thought, good. Tyrion and Jaime, the cell that wasn't. 300 AC. Jaime came to him 3 nights after the verdict. Tyrion's rooms were the same rooms he'd had before the trial. Not the Hand's Tower, not anymore, but the chambers in Maegor's Holdfast that were assigned to Lannisters of middling importance. Middling importance was what Tyrion had been reduced to, which was an improvement over condemned prisoner, but not by the margin Tyrion would have liked. Jaime stood in the doorway. One hand, the wrong hand, the hand that wasn't gold, was on the frame. His face had the particular quality it had when he was about to say something he'd been rehearsing, and that the rehearsal hadn't made easier. You're alive. 3rd time someone's opened with that observation. It hasn't gotten more insightful. I should have fought for you. Tyrion poured 2 cups. The wine was Arbor gold. He'd spent his own money on it, because the Red Keep's house wine was an insult he was no longer willing to tolerate. He pushed 1 cup across the table. You should have. You didn't. A Dornishman did it instead, and now a Dornishman has a claim on me that I didn't authorize and can't repay. He drank. Sit? You look like a statue of guilt, and statues are uncomfortable conversation partners. Jaime sat, drank. The gold hand clicked against the table when he set the cup down. The specific metallic sound that punctuated every one of Jaime's gestures now, the constant reminder of what he'd lost. I couldn't have beaten the mountain. I know. One hand. Even if I were. What I was. Before. One hand can't. I know, Jaime. I didn't ask you because I thought you'd win. I asked you because you're my brother, and I wanted to know if that meant something. Tyrion held his gaze. You told me it didn't. Not in those words. You never said no directly. You're too Lannister for that. But the answer was no, and we both knew it. The answer was, I'll die, and you'll still die. The answer was, I can't risk it, which is reasonable, which is the correct tactical assessment, which is, Tyrion drank, which is exactly what everyone in this family does, the correct tactical assessment, the rational choice, the specific Lannister optimization that produces optimal outcomes for the optimizer and suboptimal outcomes for everyone else. That's exactly what it is. Father does it, Cersei does it, you did it. The calculation that says, what is the cost to me? And that never, in my observation, includes the variable, what is the cost to the person I'm calculating about? Jaime's face tightened. Oberyn Martell fought for me. A man I'd known for 2 months, from a kingdom I'd visited once, for a cause that wasn't mine. He fought because his cause required my survival, and he was willing to risk his life for his cause. Tyrion looked at the wine. My brother wasn't willing to risk his life for mine. A stranger was. That's the kind of information that rearranges your understanding of the word family. Jaime was quiet for a long time. I'm sorry. I know. You should have done a lot of things. Starting approximately 20 years ago, when a certain woman in a certain tower was... He stopped, shook his head. Never mind. Ancient history. It's not ancient. It's ancient to me. Everything before the trial is ancient. Everything after is... this. Tyrion gestured at the room, at the city, at the situation. This is what I have now. Freedom purchased by a Dornishman, a room in a castle where half the residents want me dead, and a family that is... He paused. A family that functions the way a siege engine functions, efficiently, destructively, and with no concern for whatever it's aimed at. What are you going to do? Stay. Watch. The game is about to change, Jaime. The confession. I heard the confession. Everyone heard the confession. The question is what happens next. Oberyn didn't kill the mountain and walk away. He's here. He's alive. He has the confession and the political leverage to use it, and he's going to use it. And when he does, Father is the target. Father has always been the target. For Oberyn, for Dorne, for everyone who remembers what happened to Elia. The mountain was the sword arm. The confession points at the hand that held the sword. Jaime stood, walked to the window, King's Landing at night, the lights of Flea Bottom, the torches on the walls, the specific, uneven illumination of a city that was too old and too broken to be properly lit. He'll manage it. Father always manages it. Maybe Father has managed worse, but Father has never managed this. A public confession, a living witness, a political opponent who is both personally motivated and strategically sophisticated. Tyrion joined him at the window. Oberyn is not a blunt instrument. He's a blade with a brain. Father is used to blunt instruments. Father understands the Cleganes and the Boltons, the men who do ugly things and don't think about them. Oberyn does ugly things and thinks about them very carefully. That's a different kind of enemy. And you? Me? You said you're staying. In the game. On which side? Tyrion looked at the city, at the lights and the dark and the specific geography of a place he'd lived his whole life, and that had tried to kill him last week. My side. He drank the last of the wine. For the first time in my life, my own side. Not Father's, not Cersei's, not the family's. Mine. Jaime looked at him. That's dangerous. Everything is dangerous. At least this dangerous is mine. Jaime left. Tyrion stood at the window and thought about sides, about the specific Lannister architecture that he'd been born into and that he'd spent his life trying to be useful within, and that had, last week, tried to end him. About the fact that the architecture had a flaw. The flaw being that it optimized for the family's power and treated individual members of the family as expendable in service of that optimization. He had been expendable. He was not going to be expendable again. Oberyn. The Sand Snakes. 300 AC. The 3 eldest Sand Snakes were in King's Landing, and they were, collectively and individually, more dangerous than the thing their father had just killed. Obara was the warrior. Tall, hard-bodied, carrying a spear that was not ceremonial, and that she maintained with the specific attention of a woman for whom the weapon was not a symbol, but a profession. She was 28, and she had killed 11 men in her life, and she could name each one, and describe the circumstances, and feel nothing about any of them. which was both her greatest strength and her greatest limitation. Nymeria was the politician, beautiful in the specific way that Dornish women were beautiful when they combined the physical inheritance of 4 bloodlines with the deliberate cultivation of appearance as a tool. She was 25, and she carried daggers in places that court ladies did not carry daggers, and she read the political terrain of King's Landing with the focused attention of a woman who had been raised by Oberyn Martell to see the game and play it. Tiene was the poison. Blonde, blue-eyed, the sept girl, the sweet-faced one, the daughter who looked like innocence and who had, by the age of 23, developed a mastery of venoms and toxins that rivaled any Maester in the Citadel and exceeded most. They met their father in his rooms the night after the trial. Obara spoke first. Obara always spoke first because Obara believed that speaking first was the same as speaking loudest, and that speaking loudest was the same as being right. The mountain is dead. What comes next? Next comes the harder part. Oberyn was at the table with a map of King's Landing that he'd been annotating for 2 hours. Not a military map, a political one. The locations of the lords and their households, the channels of communication, the specific cartography of power that existed underneath the physical geography of the city. Harder than killing the mountain. Killing the mountain was the simplest part. The mountain was a body. Bodies can be broken. What comes next is a system. Systems resist breaking because systems are distributed. The power isn't in one person. It's in the connections between people. And you can't stab connections. He looked at Obara. Put the spear down. This room has enough weapons. Obara did not put the spear down. She leaned it against the wall, which was her version of compliance. Nymeria. The confession changes the landscape. The confession is a door. The door is open. What walks through it depends on us. Oberyn looked at the map. Tywin will respond. Not quickly. Tywin is strategic, not reactive. He'll spend days calculating the optimal response. During those days, we move. Move how? The lords who heard the confession are currently revising their assessment of the Lannister position. Most of them have known the truth about Elia for 20 years. What they didn't have was the public confirmation, the specific, spoken, witnessed acknowledgement that makes the truth usable. Now they have it. Oberyn traced a line on the map. The Reach Lords, the ones whose loyalty to the Tyrells is stronger than their fear of the Lannisters. They're the first targets. Then the Stormlands Lords, who have been uncomfortable with the Lannister-Baratheon arrangement since Robert died. Then the Riverlands. And the North. The North is occupied. The Boltons have Winterfell. The North is a long-term project, not an immediate lever. He looked at Nymeria. Your work, the conversations, the specific, one-on-one, room-by-room diplomacy that shifts allegiance by shifting perception. And me? Tyene's voice was sweet in the way that Tyene's voice was always sweet. The specific tonal quality that made you want to trust her, which was the entire point and which Oberyn had cultivated in his daughter since childhood, because trust was the most valuable currency in any court, and Tiene generated it the way mints generated gold. You're my insurance. If the political path fails, if Tywin moves against us before the politics can produce a result. He looked at his youngest daughter. I need to know that there's a response available that doesn't require swords. Tyene smiled. It was the sweetest smile in the Red Keep. It was also the most dangerous. Oberyn looked at his daughters. 3 of 8. 3 weapons of different kinds. The spear, the whisper, the vial. He loved them with the specific, fierce devotion of a man who had built a family outside the structures that the realm considered legitimate, and who valued that family more than the structures that rejected it. Careful, he said. All of you. We're in the lion's den. The lion is wounded, but wounded lions are the most dangerous kind. Obara, I'm not afraid of lions. I know. That's why I said careful. He held her gaze. The mountain was afraid of nothing. The mountain is dead. Fear keeps people alive. Use it. Obara's jaw tightened. But she heard him. The daughters always heard him, even when the hearing cost them. The small council. What shifted? 300 AC. The small council met 4 days after the trial, and the meeting was a disaster. Not a loud disaster. The small council did not do loud. The small council did the specific, calibrated, temperature-controlled version of institutional collapse that happened when every person in the room was aware that the dynamics had changed and that the new dynamics had not yet been established. Tywin was at the head of the table, hand of the king. His position, the position he'd held for years and that he held now with the same granite authority that he'd always held it with, except that the granite had a crack in it, not visible, not audible, but present in the way that everyone in the room spoke to him and about him and around him. Mace Tyrell was at the table, master of ships, the specific Tyrell placeholder, a man whose function was to occupy a chair and vote as his mother told him to vote, and whose contribution to governance was the contribution of a warm body in a seat. Pycelle was at the table, Grand Maester, the specific Lannister loyalist whose loyalty was so unconcealed that it functioned as a kind of transparency. Everyone knew Pycelle served the Lannisters, Pycelle knew everyone knew, and the mutual knowledge had produced a specific equilibrium that was comfortable for everyone and useful for nobody. Varys was at the table, master of whisperers, the specific absence of loyalty that was itself a form of loyalty, loyal to the realm, Varys said, which was a way of saying loyal to whoever was going to win, and I'll let you know who that is when I've finished calculating. And Cersei was at the table, not as a council member, as the Queen Regent. Her presence was not required and not optional. Cersei attended small council meetings the way Weather attended outdoor events, inevitably, unavoidably, with consequences for everyone in range. Tywin opened the meeting. The trial by combat is concluded. The verdict is binding. Lord Tyrion is free and the matter is closed. The matter is not closed, Cersei said. The legal matter is closed. The trial, my son is dead. The man who killed him is free. That is not closed. Your son's murder has been adjudicated by the gods through trial by combat. The verdict, the gods are wrong. The room went tight. Tywin looked at Cersei. The look was the look he gave to problems that were too small for their ambition. The specific Tywin gaze that communicated, without words, that the person receiving it was wasting everyone's time, including their own. The gods, Tywin said, are not wrong. The gods are the legal foundation of the Crown's authority. If the gods are wrong, the trial system is wrong. If the trial system is wrong, every verdict in the history of the Seven Kingdoms is suspect, including the verdict that put Robert Baratheon on the throne. He held her gaze. Do you want to have that conversation? Cersei's mouth opened. Closed. The specific Cersei process of having a response suppressed by logic she couldn't counter, but that she experienced as a personal insult. Moving on, Tywin said. The confession. The room adjusted. Everyone sat slightly straighter, the physical response to the approach of a dangerous topic. Gregor Clegane's confession was public and witnessed. The confession confirmed facts that were previously unconfirmed. The political implications of the confession are being managed. Managed by whom? Mace Tyrell asked. Mace asked questions when he remembered that asking questions was what council members did. The questions were usually not good. By me. Tywin's voice left no room for the suggestion that anyone else might be doing the managing. The Martells, Varys began. The Martells are being addressed. Prince Oberyn has been active in the last 4 days. Varys's voice was silk. the specific Varys texture that meant I know things that I'm about to tell you, and the telling is going to be uncomfortable. He has met with Lady Olenna. He has met with Lord Paxter Redwyn. He has met with... I know who he's met with. Then you know that the political landscape is shifting in ways that the confession has accelerated. I know that a Dornish prince is attempting to capitalize on a public spectacle. I know that the attempt will be managed the way all Dornish provocations have been managed for the past 20 years, through superior political position and the specific reality that Dorne does not have the military capacity to back its ambitions. Dorne alone does not, Varys said. Dorne with allies might. The room held. Tywin looked at Varys. The look was evaluative, the specific assessment of a man deciding whether the information he'd just received was useful or dangerous, and concluding that it was both. What allies? Prince Oberyn and Lady Olenna met in the gardens 2 days ago. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Varys folded his hands. I was not present, but the duration and the privacy suggest a conversation of substance rather than courtesy. Tywin was still the Tyrells, the allies he'd spent a year courting, the alliance that provided the grain and the swords that kept the Crown's military position viable, the specific linchpin of the post-Blackwater political architecture. The Tyrells were talking to the Martells. The Tyrells were talking to the Martells. Mace Tyrell looked confused. This was Mace Tyrell's resting state, but the confusion was deeper than usual. The specific confusion of a man who was beginning to suspect that his mother was doing something he hadn't been told about, and who was experiencing the familiar discomfort of discovering that the Tyrell strategy was several layers deeper than the layer he'd been shown. My mother meets many people, Mace said. She's sociable. Tywin ignored this. The meeting is adjourned. Varys, remain. The council left. Cersei left last, with the specific reluctant departure of a woman who knew she was being excluded from the important conversation, and who resented the exclusion with every fibre of her being. Tywin looked at Varys. Tell me everything, Varys told him. Ellaria, the night of the kill. 300 AC. Ellaria Sand had watched the fight from the gallery. She had watched with her hands gripping the rail and her body leaning forward, and the specific physiological response of a woman watching the man she loved fight the largest human being she had ever seen, which was everything. The heart rate, the breathing, the pupils, the specific full-body engagement that went beyond fear into the territory of something that didn't have a name. The state that existed when every cell in your body was aware that the next 3 minutes would determine whether the person you'd built your life around continued to exist. When the mountain fell, Ellaria didn't scream. The crowd screamed. The gallery erupted. The specific acoustic explosion of 1,000 people reacting to an outcome they hadn't expected. Ellaria sat down, hard, on the bench, and she breathed. Just breathed. The specific deep shaking breathing of someone whose body was releasing a tension it had been holding so hard that the release was itself a physical event. The muscles unlocking all at once, and the breath coming in ragged, and the vision blurring because the tears that had been held back by the tension were now released by the relief. She didn't cry in the gallery. She was Dornish, and she was the paramour of a prince, and she was in King's Landing, where every expression was observed and catalogued and potentially weaponized. She held the tears. She held them the way you held a wall in a siege, by brute force, by will, by the specific determination that the wall would not come down in public. She found Oberyn that night. He was in the apartments. The sand snakes had gone, dispersed to their own tasks, the specific Oberyn-trained independence that meant his daughters operated autonomously, even within an hour of their father killing the most feared man in the realm. The maester had been dismissed. The servants had been dismissed. Oberyn was alone in the room with a cup of wine, and the specific stillness that Ilaria recognized as the aftermath of violence. Not the violence itself, but the place the mind went when the violence was over, and the adrenaline was metabolizing, and the body was discovering what the violence had cost it. You're alive. That seems to be the consensus. Don't. Her voice broke the word in half. Don't make jokes. Not tonight. He looked at her. The performance dropped. The red viper persona, the swagger, the showmanship, the specific cultivated image of a man who treated danger as entertainment, all of it fell away, and what was left was Oberyn. Just Oberyn. The man who had 4 daughters with this woman, and who had stood 3 feet from a dying giant and demanded a name, and who had, for 4 seconds that felt like 4 years, considered getting closer. I almost didn't keep the distance. Ilaria sat beside him. I know. The pull, the rage, the 20 years of wanting to be close enough to see it happen. I almost stepped in. 3 feet became 2 became... He stopped. I could feel the gravity of it, like standing at the edge of a cliff. The cliff was his face. I wanted to be looking into his eyes when the light left. And I heard you. She looked at him. I didn't hear your voice. I heard the fact of you. The fact that you were in the gallery, and that you were watching, and that if I took that step, the step that closed the distance, you would see me die. Not from a distance, from 50 feet. You would watch my skull come apart the way... He stopped. The way Elia's skull came apart. The sentence that couldn't be finished because finishing it required acknowledging that the thing he'd been fighting against was the thing he'd almost walked into. I stayed back because dying in front of you was worse than not seeing his eyes. Ilaria took the wine from his hand. Not to drink, to remove the prop, to take away the thing he was holding that wasn't her. I didn't ask you to fight. No. I've never asked you to fight for Elia. I've never asked you to carry the vengeance. I've asked you. Her voice was tight. I've asked you to be alive. To come home. To be the father of our girls. That's what I've asked. I know. And you went into that arena anyway. I went into that arena because the confession was the only thing that could change Dorne's position, and the confession could only come from the arena, and I was the only person who could get it, because I was the only person who could fight Clegane and survive. He held her gaze. I didn't go for revenge. I went for the confession. The revenge was the vehicle. The confession was the destination. The distinction is very clever, and I don't care about it. Ilaria's eyes were red. The distinction is for the council and the history books. I was in the gallery, and I watched you fight a man twice your size, and She stopped, breathed. I can still hear the sound of his sword hitting the sand every time I close my eyes. Oberyn put his hand on hers. They sat. The room was dark except for a single candle. King's Landing at night through the window. The lights, the noise, the specific urban soundtrack of a city that didn't care about what had happened in the arena today, and that would not remember it in the way that the people inside this room would remember it. What happens now? Ilaria asked. Now I use the confession. Now I build something. Something that means Elia's death wasn't just death, that it produced something, changed something. Politics. Yes. You hate politics. I hate politics the way I hate medicine. Both are necessary. Both are unpleasant. Both keep people alive. He looked at her. I'm not going to be the red viper anymore. Not only. The arena was the last arena. What comes next is rooms and tables and the specific, unglamorous work of changing things through. He made a face. Meetings, You're going to be in meetings. I'm going to be in so many meetings. You're going to hate it. I'm going to be spectacular at it, and I'm going to hate every minute, and I'm going to do it because Elia can't, and the girls need to see that the fighting was for something beyond the fighting. Ellaria looked at him, at the man who had killed the mountain this afternoon and who was talking about meetings, at the Viper who was becoming not a different person, a more complete one, the fighter who was adding the politician, the way a blade was fitted with a hilt, the same weapon with a better grip. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The candle burned. Outside, King's Landing did what King's Landing did at night. It lived. Badly, loudly, with the specific, chaotic energy of a city that had been through too much and that was going to go through more. And that continued regardless, because cities, like people, didn't stop, just because the stopping would have been easier. They sat until the candle was gone. Then they went to bed. Tomorrow there would be meetings. Tonight there was this. Dorne. What the patient man did. 300 AC. The Raven reached Sunspear in 4 days. Oberyn Martell read it in the Water Gardens, where he spent most of his time because the warmth of the pools eased the gout that had been eating his joints for 10 years, and because the Water Gardens were the one place in Dorne where Doran could think without his brother's energy filling every available space. His brother's energy was in the letter instead. The mountain is dead. Confession obtained. Public. Witnessed by the full court. The confession names Elia. Does not name Tywin directly. Implication only. Political opportunity exists and pursuing. Need your backing. Doran read the letter 3 times. Doran wasn't Oberyn. This was the central fact of the Martell dynamic and the source of 20 years of tension between the brothers. Oberyn was fire. Fast, bright, dangerous, the kind of energy that consumed itself in the burning and that needed external management to prevent the consumption from becoming total. Doran was water, slow, patient, the kind of force that wore down mountains over centuries rather than cracking them in a single strike. Oberyn had spent 20 years demanding action. Doran had spent 20 years counseling patience. The tension between them was not disagreement about the goal. They both wanted justice for Elia. The tension was about method. Oberyn's method was the spear. Doran's method was the tide. The confession changed the method. Doran had been planning for 20 years. Not the Oberyn plan, not the spear, not the arena, not the dramatic single combat approach that his brother favored. Doran had been planning in the Doran way, slowly, invisibly, through alliances and marriages, and the specific long-game positioning that would, over decades, produce the conditions for Dornish ascendance without the risk of military catastrophe. The confession accelerated the timeline. Not destroyed it, accelerated it. The difference was crucial. Doran's plan was intact. The alliances were in place. The marriages were, being arranged, had been arranged, would produce the specific outcomes that Doran had been engineering since before Oberyn killed the mountain. The confession simply moved the timeline forward by compressing the political window. Doran wrote back. The letter said, "Backing given. Proceed. But within constraints. No military provocation, no assassination, no action that cannot be defended as legitimate political process. We win through the system, not around it." He sent the Raven. Then he called Areo Hota, his captain, and said, "Prepare. We may be going to King's Landing." Hota looked at him. "My prince, your health, my health, is the same as it's been for 10 years. Pain doesn't stop plans. It changes how the plans are executed." Doran looked at the pools, at the children playing in the water, other people's children, the children of Dornish lords and merchants, and the specific egalitarian chaos that the Water Gardens had been built to contain. "My brother has opened a door. I've been building the room behind it." "What room?" "A room where Dorne sits at the table." Not the side table, the main table, where we have been sitting for 20 years in theory, and that we are about to occupy in fact. Doran looked at the letter. Elia waited 20 years for justice. She can wait a few more weeks for it to be delivered correctly. Hotar nodded. I'll prepare. And Hotar, send word to Princess Arianne. She should know. What her uncle did. What her father has been planning. He paused. It's time the next generation understood the full picture. Hotar left. Doran sat in the water gardens. He thought about Elia, about the sister he'd lost, about the specific, grinding daily pain of knowing what had happened to her and being unwilling to act on the knowledge because acting rashly would have destroyed Dorne the way the rebellion had destroyed the Targaryens. Patience. The Martell words were unbowed, unbent, unbroken. But the real Martell word, the word that Doran had lived by for 20 years and that nobody outside the family knew, was the operating principle, was patience. Patience was not passivity. Patience was not acceptance. Patience was the specific active discipline of waiting for the right moment and then moving when the moment arrived. And the moment had arrived. And Doran Martell, who had been waiting longer than anyone, who had been called weak and timid and broken by people who confuse stillness with surrender, Doran Martell was about to move. He called for parchment. He began to write letters, many letters, to many people. The tide was coming in. Joffrey, what the chaos produced. 300 AC. Joffrey died on a Tuesday, not at a wedding. There had been no time for a second wedding, the political chaos of the trial having consumed the court's attention and energy in the weeks that followed the verdict. He died at a feast, a celebration of the trial's conclusion, Cersei's idea, because Cersei believed that performing normalcy was the same as producing it, and that a feast would communicate to the court that the Lannister position was unchanged. The Lannister position was very changed. The feast communicated the opposite of what Cersei intended, which was itself a perfect encapsulation of Cersei's approach to politics. The instinct was correct, project strength, and the execution was wrong. The projection looked desperate, which was the opposite of strength. Joffrey drank the wine. The wine was poisoned. Not by Oberyn. Oberyn had been specific with his daughters about this. No Dornish poison, no action that could be traced to Dorne, no fingerprint that could be used to blame the Martells. The arrangement with Olenna had been clear on this point. Dorne's hands were clean. The Tyrell's hands were wherever the Tyrell's hands were. The Strangler was a specific poison. It worked by constricting the throat. The progressive paralysis of the muscles that controlled swallowing and then breathing, producing a death that looked like choking, that could be attributed to food rather than venom if the investigation was casual, and that was quick enough to prevent the kind of prolonged dying that produced questions about intervention. Joffrey choked, clawed at his throat, turned a color that no living person should turn. His mother screamed. The court erupted. The Kingsguard moved. Too late. Always too late. Because the Kingsguard was designed to protect against swords and arrows and the specific visible threats that could be intercepted, not against poison in a cup that had been handed to the king by his own wine-bearer. Joffrey died on the floor of the Great Hall, with his mother holding him and his grandfather watching, and his uncle, Tyrion, standing 10 feet away, with a cup in his own hand, and the specific, horrified expression of a man who was watching a disaster happen and who was already calculating, even in the moment, even before the body was cold, how this was going to be used against him. Cersei's head came up. She looked at Tyrion. You did this. Cersei's voice was something beyond human, the sound that a mother made when her child died in her arms and the grief needed an outlet, and the outlet was whoever was closest. You killed him. I was 10 feet away, I didn't touch his cup. I didn't... Cersei, I didn't do this. Guards. Arrest? No. The voice was Tywin's, from the head table, not shouting. The specific Tywin volume that was louder than shouting because it carried the weight of absolute authority, and the room responded to authority the way metal responded to a magnet. No arrests. Not tonight. The king is dead, and the investigation will be conducted properly, by the hand, under the law. Tywin stood. The hall is sealed. No one leaves until the Kingsguard has taken statements. The cup. He pointed at the wine cup that Joffrey had been drinking from. Is to be secured for testing. Father, the imp, was 10 feet from the king when the king died. The hall was full. 100 people could have poisoned the wine. Tywin's voice was iron and ice, and the specific controlled fury of a man who was watching 2 crises happening simultaneously. The death of his grandson and the potential collapse of his political position, and who was choosing to manage both rather than succumb to either. The investigation will determine what happened. Not your grief. Cersei looked at him. The look contained something Tyrion had never seen in Cersei's face, not directed at him, directed at their father. The look of a daughter discovering that her father valued the process over her pain, that the system mattered more than her scream. She looked at Joffrey. She held her dead son. The hall was silent except for her crying and the sound of guards moving to seal the doors, and the specific, terrible intimacy of a mother's grief, performed in public, because the public was the only space available. Tyrion set down his cup. He looked at Oberyn, who was across the hall at the Dornish table. Oberyn's face was blank, controlled. The specific absence of expression that a man wore when something was happening that he'd been told about but not involved in, and that he needed to appear surprised by, while not appearing too surprised. Tyrion looked at Olenna, who was at the Tyrell table. Olenna was looking at her plate. Her face was doing nothing, which, from Olenna, was everything. Tyrion thought, the wine. He thought, Olenna. He thought, the arrangement, the thing that Oberyn and Olenna had discussed in the gardens, the compatible methods, the coordinated timing. He thought, I need to be very, very careful about what I say next, and to whom I say it. He said nothing. He stood in the hall with a dead king on the floor, and his sister screaming, and his father managing, and the 2 most dangerous people in the room performing innocence from opposite sides of the hall, and he said absolutely nothing. Bronn appeared at his shoulder, materializing the way Bronn materialized, out of whatever shadow or crowd or background he'd been occupying. Time to go. I can't leave. Father sealed the hall. Your father sealed the main doors. He didn't seal the servants' passages. Bronn looked at the hall, at Cersei, at the dead boy on the floor. She's going to blame you. You know that. Trial or no trial, verdict or no verdict. She's going to blame you. She already tried to blame me. Father stopped her. Father stopped her tonight. Tomorrow, Father investigates. Father is, whatever else he is, methodical. He won't allow a second accusation without evidence because a second failed accusation destroys whatever's left of the legal system that props up the crown. That's a lot of faith in your father. It's not faith. It's calculation. Father doesn't protect me because he loves me. He protects the system because the system is what keeps him in power. Tyrion looked at the hall. The system just killed a king. Father's going to find out who did it, because the system requires that the answer be found and that the answer be correct. And if the correct answer is someone your father can't touch. Tyrion looked at Bronn. Then the game gets very interesting. Tommen, what the boy inherited. 300 a sea. Tommen Baratheon was 8 years old and he was king. He did not want to be king. He wanted his cats. He wanted the specific domestic routine of a boy who liked breakfast and kittens and who had been shielded from the ugliest parts of his family's dysfunction by the combination of being the younger son and being genuinely, earnestly sweet in a way that the court found either endearing or pathetic, depending on who was doing the finding. He sat on the Iron Throne for the first time on a Wednesday morning, one day after his brother died, wearing clothes that were too big because nobody had thought to have clothes made, and the smallest available ceremonial garments had been Joffrey's, and Joffrey had been larger. The throne swallowed him. An 8-year-old on the Iron Throne looked like a child sitting in a giant's chair. The specific visual absurdity of a boy whose feet didn't reach the floor, occupying a seat designed for conquerors. The symbolism so obvious that even the lords who were committed to the fiction of monarchy found it difficult to take seriously. Tywin stood beside the throne, hand of the king, the same position he'd occupied for 2 kings now. The specific Tywin function of standing beside thrones and managing the person sitting in them. Margaery stood on the other side. Not queen, not yet. The formalities had not been completed. But present, positioned. The specific Tyrell positioning that communicated, "We are here and we intend to stay," and the transition from Joffrey to Tommen does not change our arrangement. The court assembled. Tywin spoke. He spoke about continuity and stability, and the specific vocabulary of a regime assuring itself that the regime was stable, which was what regimes did when they weren't stable. And the speaking was both necessary and transparent, and everyone in the room understood both the necessity and the transparency. Then, the investigation into King Joffrey's death is ongoing. Maester Pycelle has confirmed the presence of a toxic agent in the wine. The specific agent is being identified. The investigation will proceed under my authority, and the results will be presented to the court when complete. Cersei, in the front row, wearing black, her face the specific controlled devastation of a woman holding together in public what had come apart in private. My son was murdered. Your son was killed. The distinction between murder and assassination and other categories of killing is what the investigation will determine. Tywin looked at the court. No accusations will be made without evidence. No arrests will be conducted without cause. The law will be followed. The law will be followed. Tywin said it as a statement. It landed as a threat. The specific Tywin threat that was delivered as a principle and received as a warning. The law will be followed, and the following would be Tywin's, and the results would be Tywin's, and whoever had killed the king would answer to Tywin's law, which was the only law that mattered. Tyrion watched from the gallery. He watched, and he thought, "Father knows." Or suspects. The investigation is not going to find the Tyrells because the Tyrells are too careful to leave evidence. The investigation is going to find a convenient answer, a servant, a fool, a scapegoat, and the convenient answer will close the case, and the real answer will remain known but unprovable, and the knowing will become a tool that Father uses to manage the Tyrell alliance. He was partly right. The investigation found the fool. Tywin, the investigation. 300 AC. Ser Dontos Hollard was found in the harbour with his throat cut 3 days after the feast. He had been a fool, literally, the court fool, a former knight stripped of his knighthood who had been performing at court events for the past year. The investigation connected him to the wine. He had been seen near the cup. He had the opportunity. And he was now dead, which was both suspicious and convenient. Dead men couldn't be questioned. Tywin presented the findings to the small council. Ser Dontos was involved in the poisoning. The specific agent, the Strangler, a compound restricted to the Citadel and to specific merchants in the Free Cities, was likely introduced through a gem on a hairnet worn by... He paused, The pause was calculated. Everything about this presentation was calculated. By a guest at the feast. Which guest? Cersei demanded. The investigation has not determined which guest. Tywin looked at the council. Ser Dontos is dead. His co-conspirator, the provider of the poison, has not been identified. The investigation continues. This was Tywin's solution. The convenient answer that closed the immediate case without closing the larger question. The fool was guilty. The fool was dead. The fool's accomplice was unknown. The investigation would continue indefinitely, which meant the investigation would continue for as long as the continuation was useful to Tywin and would conclude when concluding became more useful than continuing. Oberyn watched this from the Dornish delegation's position. He saw what Tywin was doing. The partial closure, enough to satisfy the court's need for answers, insufficient to threaten the Tyrell alliance. Tywin knew, Oberyn was certain that Tywin knew or suspected the Tyrells. But Tywin couldn't act on the knowledge because acting on it meant losing the Tyrells. And losing the Tyrells meant losing the grain and the swords and the specific economic and military foundation that kept the Lannister position viable. Tywin was trapped. Not imprisoned. Trapped in the specific way that powerful men were trapped by the very alliances that made them powerful. The Tyrells were both the support and the threat, and the support and the threat were the same people. And Tywin couldn't remove the threat without removing the support. Oberyn found this deeply satisfying. Not the death of a boy. Oberyn had no feelings about Joffrey, who had been a monster in the specific way that pampered, unchecked boys became monsters, but whose death was a political event rather than a moral one. Joffrey's death didn't produce justice. It produced opportunity. The opportunity was Tommen, 8 years old. Manageable. Sweet. The kind of king who would be managed by whoever stood behind the throne. And the question of who stood behind the throne was the question that the next weeks would answer. Tywin intended to stand behind the throne. Tywin had been standing behind thrones for 40 years, and the position was, in Tywin's calculation, permanently his. Oberyn intended to change the calculation. The shift. What Oberyn built. 300 AC. Oberyn worked for 6 weeks. Not in the arena. In rooms, in gardens, in the specific quiet spaces where politics actually happened, which were not the throne room and not the small council chamber, but the hallways between them, the dinners that weren't formal events, the walks in the garden that looked like leisure and were actually negotiations. Nymeria was his instrument. She had her mother's beauty and her father's intelligence, and the specific combination produced a woman who could enter a room and leave it with information that hadn't been there when she arrived. Extracted through conversation that the provider didn't realize was extraction until the conversation was over and the information was gone. She talked to the Reach Lords, not the Tyrells, the lords beneath the Tyrells, the vassal houses whose loyalty to Highgarden was real, but whose comfort with the Lannister alliance was limited. She learned what they wanted: security, recognition, the specific assurance that their position in the realm's hierarchy was not contingent on the Lannister-Tyrell arrangement continuing in its current form. She talked to the Stormlands lords, the survivors of the Blackwater, the men who had followed Stannis south and who had been defeated and who were now in the uncomfortable position of having backed the wrong king while the right king died and the current king was 8 years old. They wanted pardons. They wanted their lands confirmed. They wanted to stop being treated as defeated enemies and start being treated as lords whose loyalty was available for the right price. She talked to the Riverlands representatives. Edmure Tully was a prisoner at the Twins, Walder Frey's guest, which was a polite word for a hostage whose value decreased with every day that the political situation changed. The Riverlands wanted Edmure back. The Riverlands wanted the Freys punished for the betrayal of guest right that the Red Wedding would have been, had nearly been in this timeline, had been prevented only because the political dynamics had shifted fast enough that Walder Frey's calculation changed before the knives came out. Nymeria brought all of this back to Oberyn. Oberyn mapped it on the wall of his room in the Red Keep, using the specific cartography of political alliance that he'd developed over 30 years of operating in the grey spaces between courts. Oberyn built a picture of what the realm would look like with a different hand. The picture was this: a coalition, not a Dornish coalition. Dorne alone was too small, too remote, too historically marginalized to serve as the center of a new political arrangement. A broad coalition, Tyrell Dornish at the core, with Stormlands and Riverlands support, anchored by the specific legitimacy of a small council that represented the realm rather than one house. The small council was the key, not the throne. The throne was Tommen's, and Tommen was manageable by whoever held the positions around the throne. The small council was where the actual decisions were made, and the small council was currently Tywin's. Changing the small council changed the governance. Changing the governance changed the kingdom. Oberyn needed Tywin removed as hand. Not killed. Removed. This was the constraint that Doran had imposed, and that Oberyn, despite every instinct that screamed for a more permanent solution, was honoring. Killing Tywin would start a war. Removing Tywin through political process would produce a transition. Transitions were survivable. Wars were not. Not for Dorne. Not with the military capacity available. The removal required a catalyst. The catalyst arrived from an unexpected direction. Tyrion, the catalyst. 300 AC. Tyrion found the ledger. Not intentionally. He found it the way he found most things, by being in a room where he wasn't supposed to be, and looking at things he wasn't supposed to look at, and noticing what the thing said, when nobody was managing what the thing said. The ledger was in the office of the Master of Coin, a position that had been occupied by Littlefinger, and that was now occupied by nobody, because Littlefinger was in the Vale being Lord Protector, and nobody had been appointed to replace him, and the office had been operating on institutional momentum and the specific bureaucratic autopilot that happened when a position was empty and the machinery kept grinding because machinery didn't know it was supposed to stop. The ledger documented the Crown's debt, not the public debt, the 6 million gold dragons owed to the Iron Bank, which was known, which was managed, which was the specific acknowledged financial crisis that the Crown was navigating with the desperate creativity of an institution that owed more than it could pay. The private debt. The debt that was owed to Casterly Rock. 3 million gold dragons, lent by Tywin Lannister to the Crown over a period of 10 years. Interest accumulating. The specific financial architecture of a man who had made his own grandson's government dependent on his personal fortune, and who was using the dependency as a lever to control the governance. Tyrion sat with the ledger for 3 hours. He'd known about the debt in general terms. Everyone knew that the Crown was in debt to the Iron Bank and to the Lannisters. What Tyrion hadn't known was the specificity, the interest rates, the repayment terms, the specific clauses that gave Tywin operational control over the Treasury's decisions. The clauses were not loans. They were chains. The Crown couldn't replace Tywin as Han without triggering the debt clauses. The debt clauses required immediate repayment in the event of termination of the lending arrangement. The lending arrangement was defined as the service of Lord Tywin Lannister to the Crown in a capacity consistent with his position. Translation: fire Tywin and the debt comes due. The debt comes due, and the Crown bankrupts. The Crown bankrupts and the realm collapses. Tywin had built himself a trap for anyone who tried to remove him. A financial deadman's switch that ensured his position was permanent because the alternative to his position was economic catastrophe. Tyrion took the ledger to Oberyn, not to Tywin. The fact that Tyrion's first instinct was to bring the information to Oberyn rather than his father was itself the most significant decision Tyrion had made in his life. The decision was not dramatic. It was the specific, quiet crossing of a line that had been approaching for years. The line between I am a Lannister who has been mistreated by my family and I am a person who is choosing a different side. Oberyn read the ledger. He read it the way he read everything. Quickly, thoroughly, with the specific intelligence of a man who had been educated at the Citadel and who understood financial instruments the way he understood poisons, as tools with specific properties and specific applications. He chained the throne to his purse. He built a system where removing him destroys the economy. The debt clauses they're not standard lending terms. They're political instruments disguised as financial ones. Can they be broken? Not without defaulting on the debt. Default triggers the Iron Bank's terms as well. The bank's loans are cross-collateralized with the Lannister loans. Pull one thread and the whole fabric comes apart. Unless? Tyrion looked at him. Unless the debt is refinanced, replaced. The Lannister loans paid off with different capital. Capital that doesn't carry political strings. Oberyn looked at the ledger. The Tyrell treasury. The Reach is the wealthiest region in the realm. If the Tyrells assumed the Lannister debt, bought it effectively, the chains break. The Tyrells would never do it for free, but the Tyrells might do it for the handship. The room adjusted. The idea was large and the room felt smaller around it. You're proposing, Tyrion said, that the Tyrells buy my father's debt, pay it off, in exchange for which my father loses the financial leverage that keeps him as hand. The Tyrells become the crown's creditor, and the new hand is someone the Tyrells trust, someone Dorne trusts, someone who represents the coalition rather than one house. Who? That's the negotiation. Oberyn set down the ledger. But the mechanism is here, in these numbers. Your father built a cage around the throne, and the cage has a key, and the key is money. He looked at Tyrion. Lannisters always pay their debts. What happens when someone else pays them first? Tyrion sat with this. He thought about his father, about Tywin's face in the gallery at the trial, the mask, the control, the absolute refusal to acknowledge that a tool had been lost, and a trial had been lost, and a position was eroding. He thought about the family, about the specific Lannister architecture that he'd been born inside, and that had tried to kill him, and that was now, through this ledger, revealed to be not just a family, but a financial instrument, a system of leverage and dependency that Tywin had built not through blood, but through gold. Lannisters always pay their debts. The debts were the power. The debts were the position. The debts were the trap. And Tyrion, the son who had been expendable, the dwarf who had been sentenced to death by his own family's champion, was holding the key. Do it, Tyrion said. Do what? Take it to Olenna, the ledger, the proposal, the refinancing. He held Oberyn's gaze. Break the cage. Oberyn looked at him. You're betraying your father. My father tried to have me killed. This is not betrayal. This is... He searched for the word. Found it. Consequence. Oberyn took the ledger. The negotiation. What the money did. Olenna Tyrell read the ledger in her rooms with a glass of wine and the specific, concentrated attention of a woman who had been managing a great house's finances for 40 years and who recognized, in these numbers, the shape of the opportunity she'd been waiting for. 3 million. 3 million, with interest, owed to Casterly Rock. Oberyn sat across from her. The clauses require repayment upon termination of Tywin's service. The debt is the chain. And you want us to buy the chain. I want you to break the chain. Buy the debt. Pay it off. Replace the Lannister hold on the treasury with a Tyrell hold that comes with different terms. Different terms being? The handship. A reconstituted small council. Dornish representation. The specific political architecture that you and I discussed in the gardens, made operational through financial restructuring rather than military force. Olenna looked at the ledger. She looked at the numbers. She did the math. 3 million gold dragons is not trivial, even for the Reach. 3 million gold dragons is the cost of becoming the most powerful house in the Seven Kingdoms. Currently, that title belongs to the Lannisters, and it belongs to them because of this ledger. Transfer the ledger, and you transfer the title. And Tywin, when the debt is paid and his leverage is gone, Tywin goes home, to the Rock, as Lord of Casterly Rock, which is what he's always been. The handship goes to whoever we agree on. The small council is restructured. Dorne gets a seat. The Tyrells get the position they've been paying for with grain and swords, and that they haven't received because Tywin has been standing between them and the throne. Olenna drank her wine. Mace as hand. Mace as anything you want. Mace is... Oberyn searched for the diplomatic phrasing. Failed. Mace is mace. Mace is a turnip in a lord's coat. I know. Olenna set down her glass. I don't want mace as hand. Mace as hand would be a catastrophe that I would have to manage daily for the rest of my life. I want... She looked at Oberyn. Kevan Lannister. Oberyn's eyebrows rose. Kevan is competent. Kevan is loyal to the realm rather than to Tywin personally. Kevan is manageable, in the way that competent, decent men are manageable, which is through the specific fact of their competence and decency. She held the gaze. A Tyrell hand produces a faction fight. A Dornish hand produces a war. A Lannister hand who is not Tywin produces the specific appearance of continuity while the substance changes. Kevan serves the crown. The crown serves the coalition. Doran will not love this. Doran is a patient man. Patient men understand that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that the good, delivered now, is worth more than the perfect. Delivered never. Oberyn considered this. He considered it the way he considered everything. Quickly, from multiple angles, with the specific intelligence that made him both dangerous and effective. The Kevan proposal was not what he wanted. What he wanted was Tywin's head. What was available was Tywin's removal, and the removal was more valuable than the head because the removal was achievable, and the head was a war. Kevan, Oberyn said, with conditions. Name them. A seat on the council for Dorne. Formal acknowledgement. Not a trial, not a verdict. A formal acknowledgement that the murder of Oberyn Martell and her children was committed by Gregor Clegane, now dead, under orders that originated from the office of the Hand of the King. He held the gaze. Not Tywin by name. The office, the institution, the specific acknowledgement that the system produced the atrocity and that the system has been reformed. That's... Olenna considered. That's workable. That gives Dorne the acknowledgement without the war, and gives the realm the narrative. The narrative being, the system was corrupt. The system has been reformed. The new arrangement, the coalition, the restructured council, is the reform. Olenna looked at him. You're better at this than you pretend to be. I pretend to be a viper with a spear. That's not pretending. I am a viper with a spear. I'm also a viper with a graduate education and 30 years of court experience. The spear gets the attention. The education gets the result. Olenna stood. I'll fund the debt purchase. Through the Tyrell treasury, Margaery will be queen. Tommen's queen, which is significantly more pleasant than Joffrey's queen, for everyone involved. The handship goes to Kevan under the conditions we've discussed. She held out her hand. Done. Oberyn took her hand. Done. They shook on the realignment of the Seven Kingdoms' power structure with the casual efficiency of two people who had been doing deals for longer than most of the court had been alive. and who understood that the handshake was the contract and the words were decoration. Tywin, The Fall, 300 AC. He learned about the debt refinancing on a Thursday morning. The notification came through the Master of Coin's office, the same office where Tyrion had found the ledger, the office that was still operating without a permanent occupant, and that was therefore operating with the specific, bureaucratic vulnerability of a machine running without supervision. The notification said, the Crown's debt to House Lannister, totaling 3,200,000 gold dragons, plus accumulated interest, had been repaid in full. The repayment had been conducted through a transfer from the Tyrell Treasury, authorized by Lady Olenna Tyrell as financial representative of House Tyrell, and countersigned by Grand Maester Pycelle as institutional witness. Pycelle, Tywin's own loyalist, signing the document that freed the crown from Tywin's grip. Tywin sat with the notification. He sat with it the way he had sat with the Mountain's confession, with the 11 minutes of stillness that were Tywin's version of catastrophe. The numbers on the page were not just numbers. They were the removal of the structure he'd built over 10 years, the financial architecture that ensured his position was permanent, the trap that no one was supposed to be able to spring, because no one was supposed to have the money. The Tyrells had the money. He picked up the notification, read it again, set it down. He called for Kevan. Kevan came. Kevan was 55, solid, the specific kind of competent that existed in the shadow of brilliance, not Tywin's equal, but Tywin's complement, the man who executed what Tywin designed and who had been doing so for 30 years with the specific loyalty of a brother who had chosen to serve rather than compete. You've seen the refinancing? Kevan nodded. I signed the counter-signature. Tywin looked at him. You signed? I signed it because it was the legal instrument by which the Crown's debt was reduced. As a member of the Council, I am required to countersign financial instruments that benefit the Crown's fiscal position. Kevan held his brother's gaze. The instrument benefits the Crown. The instrument removes your leverage. Yes. It removes your financial hold on the Treasury and replaces it with a Tyrell hold that carries different terms. Kevan sat down. Tywin, I signed it because it was the right thing to do. The right thing. The Crown was being held hostage by our own family's debt. That debt was designed to ensure your position. I know that. You know I know that. The realm didn't know it. Until now. Until someone found the ledger and showed it to people who could act on it. Tyrion. Probably. I don't know who found it. I know the finding happened and the finding produced the refinancing, and the refinancing is done. Tywin's face was the mask, the 40-year mask. But behind the mask, and Kevan could see behind the mask because Kevan had been looking at it for 50 years, something was happening. Not collapse, not defeat. Recalculation, the specific Tywin process of encountering a new variable and incorporating it into the model. They'll ask me to step down. They'll ask you to step down. And the replacement? Kevan was silent. Tywin looked at his brother. You. That has been suggested. By whom? By the people who arranged the refinancing. The Tyrells, the Martells, and others. Others. A coalition, broad enough that opposing it would require the military option, and the military option is... Kevan paused. He was choosing words with the specific care of a man who was about to say something that would change his relationship with his brother permanently. The military option is the option that destroys the realm, and I will not support the destruction of the realm to preserve your position. The room was very quiet. You're choosing them over me. I'm choosing the realm over the arrangement. The arrangement served the realm for 20 years. The confession changed it. The murder of the king changed it. The debt revelation changed it. The arrangement is over, Tywin. Kevan's voice was steady, but his hands were not. This was the hardest thing he'd ever done, and the doing was visible in the tremor that 30 years of serving his brother couldn't suppress. Go home, to the Rock, as Lord of Casterly Rock, with dignity and position and life. Go home alive and powerful and defeated. And transitioned. Transition is not defeat. Transition is the world changing and the people in it changing with it. And the men who refuse to change are the men who are removed by force. I'm offering you the alternative to force. Tywin looked at his brother. The mask held. The mask always held. But behind it, Kevan saw this, because Kevan had been seeing it for 50 years. Behind it, something was being put down, not gracefully, not with acceptance, with the specific, grudging Lannister acknowledgement that the position was untenable, and that the man who had built it was the last person who would admit it. I want terms. You'll have terms, generous terms. The coalition is not trying to destroy you. The coalition is trying to replace you. Those are different projects, and the difference matters. Tywin stood. He walked to the window, King's Landing below. The city he'd been running for 20 years, through Aerys, through Robert, through Joffrey, through the specific, unbroken continuity of Tywin Lannister standing behind thrones and managing the people sitting in them. The Lion of the Rock, he said. Not to Kevan, to the window, to the city, to the specific accumulation of 40 years of being the most powerful man in the 7 kingdoms and finding that the power had been not taken, outmaneuvered, by a Dornish prince and a Tyrell grandmother and a dwarf with a ledger. When? He asked. Within the week. Tywin left the Tower of the Hand. He left it the way he left everything. Upright, composed, the mask in place. The specific performance of control maintained until the door closed and the corridor was empty and the performance had no audience. He went to the Rock. Cersei. The departure. 300 AC. She packed herself. This was the detail that the servants would remember and talk about for years afterward. That the Queen Regent, the Queen Mother, Cersei Lannister, who had not dressed herself in 20 years and who had not folded a garment since childhood, packed her own trunk. Not because there were no servants available, because the act of packing was the act of choosing what to take, and leaving was already a humiliation, and allowing someone else to choose what she took would have been a humiliation compounded. And Cersei's pride, the specific Lannister pride that was both her defining quality and her most consistent limitation, would not permit compounding. She packed the green gown, the gold jewelry, the portrait of Joffrey, small, commissioned when he was 6, before the cruelty had fully calcified, when his face still had the softness of a child who might have been something other than what he became. She packed this portrait because it was the Joffrey she wanted to remember, and because memory was the one thing the new arrangement couldn't confiscate. She did not pack the crown. The crown was Margaery's now. The crown and the king and the throne and the city and the specific position that Cersei had occupied since Robert's death, and that she had defended with every tool available, and that she had lost. Not to an army, not to a battle, but to a poisoned cup, and a Dornish spear, and a ledger. A ledger. Cersei Lannister, daughter of Tywin, twin of Jaime, Queen Regent of the 7 Kingdoms, had been undone by numbers on a page, by debt clauses, by the specific financial architecture that her father had built, and that her brother, her monstrous, despised, unkillable brother, had handed to the enemies. She found Tyrion before she left. He was in the corridor outside his chambers, the middling chambers, the rooms of a Lannister who was neither in power nor in prison, the specific liminal space that Tyrion had occupied his entire life, and that he was, apparently, going to continue occupying. You did this." Tyrion looked at her. "I did what?" "The ledger, the debt, father's removal. I found a document. I showed it to people who could use it. The document spoke for itself. You betrayed your family. My family tried to have me killed. I find that the impulse toward family loyalty diminishes somewhat when the family in question is actively engineering your execution. Joffrey was murdered. Joffrey was poisoned by someone who wasn't me. The trial determined that. The gods determined that. Your own champion died confirming that." He held her gaze. "I am sorry about Joffrey. Not the king. The boy. The boy might have been something. The king was a monster. The distinction matters, and you've never been willing to see it." Cersei's face. The green eyes. The same green eyes as his. The same Lannister green that their father had, and their mother had. And that was the family's physical signature. The color that meant power and gold, and the specific institutional cruelty that the family had elevated to statecraft. "I will not forget this." "I know. When I come back..." "You're not coming back, Cersei. The arrangement doesn't include a return clause. The Rock is where you live now. The Rock and the West and the specific domain that Lannisters have held for 1,000 years, which is, objectively, not a bad outcome for a woman who spent the last year on the wrong side of every calculation she made. You're enjoying this. I'm surviving this. There's a difference. Enjoyment requires the absence of threat. I am not absent of threat. I am merely in a different kind of threat than the kind you represent. And the new kind is marginally more survivable than the old kind." He paused. "Travel well, Cersei. Give my regards to father." She walked past him. She didn't look back. Tyrion stood in the corridor and watched her go and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief. Nothing. The specific emotional null state that happened when a relationship that had been defined by pain was terminated. And the termination produced not relief, but the discovery that the pain had been, for years, the only connection. She was his sister. She had wanted him dead. She was going to the Rock. He was staying in King's Landing. That was the arrangement. It was the best arrangement available. He went back to his rooms. Oberyn, the nursery, 300 AC. He went to the nursery at midnight. Not Tommen's nursery, the old one. The one in Maegor's Holdfast, where Elia had kept the children, Rhaenys and Aegon. The room that had been Elia's last room. The room where she'd been when Clegane came through the door. The room had been repurposed. Of course it had. 20 years of Baratheon occupation had erased the physical evidence of what the room had been. The walls were different. The furniture was different. The specific geography of a nursery. The crib placement. The window hangings. The small accumulated artifacts of children living in a space was gone. But the room was the room. The walls were the walls. The floor was the floor. And Oberyn stood in the doorway and looked at the room and felt. He expected to feel rage. He expected the specific combustion that had driven him for 20 years, the hot, Dornish fury that had fueled the spear and the poison and the arena and the confession and all of it. He felt tired. Not the tiredness of exertion, the tiredness of completion, the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something for 20 years and who had set it down. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough of it that the remaining weight was noticeable as lighter rather than as heavy. He stepped into the room. He stood where the crib had been. He didn't know exactly where the crib had been. 20 years had rearranged the room, and his memory of the room was second-hand anyway, built from descriptions and reports, and the specific forensic reconstruction of a scene he hadn't witnessed. But he stood approximately where Aegon had slept, where the baby had been when Clegane took him from the crib. And he stopped the thought. He'd been stopping the thought for 20 years. The specific details of what Clegane did to Aegon, a baby, an infant, a child who had been alive for less than a year. The details were the thing that Oberyn had been carrying under the rage. The rage was the surface. The details were the foundation. And the details were the thing he couldn't set down, couldn't lighten, couldn't reduce through any amount of political maneuvering or institutional reform. Aegon was dead. Rhaenys was dead. Elia was dead. The Mountain was dead. And Tywin was removed. And a Martell sat at the small council, and none of it brought them back. This was the thing nobody told you about vengeance. The song said vengeance was fire, hot, cleansing, the flame that burned the injustice and left clean ground. Vengeance was not fire. Vengeance was architecture. You built it carefully. You maintained it for years. You executed it with precision. And when it was done, you stood in the building you'd constructed and discovered that the building was empty. The injustice was still there. The dead were still dead. The only thing that had changed was the living, who had been rearranged by the vengeance into new positions that were better, more just, more equitable, but not healed, not fixed, not undone. Oberyn stood in the nursery. "I killed him," he said, to the room, to the absence, to the sister who wasn't there, and the children who weren't there, and the specific, ghost-populated silence of a room where terrible things had happened, and that had been cleaned and repurposed, and that still, if you stood still enough, if you let the silence go deep enough, carried the echo. "I killed the man who killed you. I got the confession. I got the seat. I got..." He stopped. His voice was doing something it didn't do in public. Breaking. The specific fracture of a man whose performance was flawless, and whose performance was over, and who was now in private, in midnight, in a room where nobody could see him, allowing the thing underneath the performance to surface. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. Nothing would be enough. Nothing, short of time moving backward and the thing not happening at all, is enough. He breathed. But it's what I have. The seat, the council, the specific, incremental, unglamorous project of making the world slightly less likely to produce another Clegane and another Elia and another nursery. He stood for another 10 minutes. Then he left. He went back to his rooms. He slept. Not well. Oberyn never slept well in King's Landing. The city was too hot and too loud and too full of ghosts. But he slept. And in the morning he went to the small council, and he sat at the table, and he did the work. The work was not vengeance. The work was what came after. Varys. What the spider noted. 300 AC. Varys watched everything. This was not a metaphor. Varys had, through 30 years of cultivating informants and building networks and maintaining the specific infrastructure of surveillance that the position of Master of Whisperers required, developed the ability to observe the political landscape of King's Landing with a comprehensive awareness that bordered on omniscience. He had watched Oberyn fight the Mountain. He had watched the confession. He had watched Olenna and Oberyn meet in the gardens. He had watched Tyrion find the ledger. He had watched Kevan choose the realm over his brother. He had watched the entire sequence, the specific chain of events that had begun with the Dornish spear in a trial arena, and that had ended with the most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms being sent home to his castle. He found it not satisfying. Satisfaction was an emotion, and Varys mistrusted emotions the way a locksmith mistrusted locks that were too easy to pick. He found it informative. The information was this. the realm could change. Not through revolution. Revolution was the Targaryen method, the Dragonfire approach, the application of overwhelming force to a system that resisted change. Revolution produced rubble. What Oberyn had demonstrated was something different. Reform, the specific, patient, politically mediated process of changing the system from within the system, using the system's own mechanisms, its laws, its finances, its traditions, to produce a different outcome. Varys had been working toward a different reform, a Targaryen restoration. Across the sea, in Essos, there were plans. Plans that Varys had been nurturing for years. Plans that involved a dragon queen and an army, and the specific, dramatic return that made better stories and that Varys had, until now, believed was the only way to change a system this resistant to change. Oberyn had shown him another way. Not a better way. Different. A way that didn't require dragons or invasions or the specific catastrophic upheaval that a Targaryen return would produce. A way that used the existing pieces, the Tyrell's gold, the Dornish grievance, the Lannister debt, to reshape the board without flipping it. Varys sat in his chambers. He thought about the Dragon Queen in Essos, about the plans he'd been making, about the specific question that Oberyn's success raised. If the realm could be reformed through politics, was the revolution still necessary? He didn't have an answer. He had a question, which was better. Answers were static. Questions were productive. And the question that Oberyn's victory had produced was the most productive question Varys had encountered in 30 years of asking questions. What kind of realm do we want? Not who sits on the throne. Not which house rules. What kind? The question was new. The question was, potentially, the beginning of something. Varys folded his hands. He waited. He was very good at waiting. The new arrangement, what followed. Kevan Lannister was named Hand of the King on the first day of the new month. The ceremony was modest. Kevan didn't do spectacle, which was itself a message. The Tywin era had been defined by the projection of power through visible means, the gold, the lion, the specific Lannister aesthetic of wealth deployed as intimidation. Kevan's handship began with a quiet ceremony and a speech that lasted 4 minutes and that said, in essence, the work continues, the law applies, the realm endures. Tommen sat on the throne and looked small and serious and slightly confused, which was an improvement over Joffrey in every conceivable metric. The small council reconvened. The new composition, Hand of the King, Sir Kevan Lannister, competent, decent, the specific anti-Tywin who was a Lannister by blood and a public servant by temperament. Master of Coin, Willas Tyrell, the crippled eldest Tyrell son, sent from Highgarden by Olenna because Willas was brilliant with numbers and because a Tyrell controlling the treasury was the quid pro quo of the refinancing. Master of Ships, unchanged, Mace. Tyrell remained because removing Mace from the council would have insulted the Tyrells, and because Mace in the ship's position was the kind of harmless appointment that maintained an alliance without actually giving the appointee anything to damage. Master of Whisperers, Varys, unchanged. Varys survived transitions the way cockroaches survived fires, through the specific evolutionary advantage of being useful to whoever was in charge. Master of Laws, Prince Oberyn Martell. This was the seat that changed everything. A Dornish prince on the small council. For the first time in anyone's memory. Dorne, which had been the last kingdom to join and the first to be marginalized, which had been treated for a century as the annoying appendix of the realm that the rest of the body neither needed nor wanted, was sitting at the table. Oberyn took the seat with the specific, deliberate satisfaction of a man who had fought, manipulated, allied, and strategized his way to a position that his family had been denied for 20 years, and that Aaliyah's murder had made necessary. He sat at the table, and he looked at the other members and he thought, this is what the confession produced. Not justice. Not yet. Justice was the larger project, the decades-long work of reforming the system that had produced the Cleganes and the Tywins, and the specific institutional cruelty that turned princesses into casualties. Justice was coming. This seat was the start. Tyrion watched from the gallery. He was not on the council. He had asked, half seriously, with the specific self-deprecating humour that was his default mode, and Kevan had told him, kindly, that a Lannister who had betrayed the family's financial position was not going to be rewarded with a council seat. Tyrion had accepted this. He understood the logic even as he resented the result. He was, however, free. Free in King's Landing. Free to move, to think, to operate in the specific grey spaces that had always been his natural habitat. Free to watch the new arrangement and to contribute to it from outside the official structure, the way he had always contributed, through intelligence, through observation, through the specific value add of being the person in the room who saw what everyone else missed. Cersei was gone. Not dead. Gone. Sent to the Rock with Tywin, by mutual agreement between Kevan and Olenna, because Cersei in King's Landing was a destabilizing force that the new arrangement could not afford, and because Cersei with her father was a contained problem rather than an escalating one. She went screaming. Not literally, because Cersei had enough Lannister composure to leave a city without screaming, but with the specific compressed fury of a woman who had lost everything: a son, a throne, a city, a position, and who was being shipped to the Rock like a piece of furniture that the new owners didn't want. Margaery married Tommen on a spring morning. The wedding was small, deliberately small, a correction of the Joffrey-era excess. Margaery was queen. Tommen was king. The Tyrell position was, at last, exactly what Olenna had been building toward since before the War of the Five Kings. Doran arrived from Sunspear. He came to King's Landing for the first time in 20 years, carried in a litter because his legs would not carry him, attended by Arya Hota, wearing the orange and red of House Martell. He came because the seat was taken, because his brother was on the small council, because the thing he'd been patient about for 20 years had produced a result, and the result needed to be witnessed. He met Oberyn in the Martell apartments. The brothers looked at each other. "You killed the mountain," Doran said. "I killed the mountain. You got the confession. I got the confession. And then you..." Doran gestured at the room, at the city, at the specific, improbable political architecture that Oberyn had built in 6 weeks of maneuvering that had been fueled by rage and intelligence and the cooperation of a Tyrell grandmother who hated Lannisters as much as the Martells did, if for different reasons. All of this. Oberyn sat across from his brother. "Are you satisfied?" Satisfied is not a word I use. What word do you use? Progressing. Doran looked at his hands, the swollen joints, the gout that had been eating him for 10 years, the specific physical deterioration that had been misread by the realm as weakness, and that was, in fact, the container for the most patient political mind in Dorne. Elia isn't avenged. Elia is acknowledged. The system that killed her has been reformed. The man who ordered her death has been removed from power. He looked at Oberyn. That is progress. It is not completion. Completion would be Tywin's head. Completion would be a dawn where our children don't have to worry about what happened to our sister happening again. Tywin's head is satisfying. A reformed council is functional. He held Oberyn's gaze. "I'll take functional. That's the most pragmatic thing you've ever said." "I've been saying pragmatic things for 20 years. You haven't been listening because pragmatic things don't sound dramatic enough for a man with a spear." Oberyn almost laughed. "The council seat," Doran said. "You'll keep it. I'll keep it. You'll..." Doran paused. The pause of a man choosing his words with the specific care of someone who had been choosing words for 20 years, and who understood that the wrong word to the wrong brother at the wrong time could undo decades of work. You'll be a counselor, not a fighter, not a provocateur, a counselor. I'll be what the seat requires. The seat requires patience. I just spent 6 weeks outmaneuvering Tywin Lannister through financial instruments and political alliances. That's patience, Doran. That's your kind of patience. I just did it faster. Doran looked at his brother. Yes, he said. You did. The Martell brothers sat in the apartments that had been given to the Dornish delegation in the Red Keep of King's Landing, in the city that had killed their sister, and that was now, for the first time in 20 years, a place where Martells had power. Not enough power, not justice, not completion, but a seat at the table, the right table. What if Oberyn Martell killed the Mountain? He kept his distance. That's the whole thing. 3 feet instead of 3 inches. The gap between glory and death, between the dramatic gesture that made better songs and the disciplined patience that produced better outcomes. He kept his distance, and the Mountain died on the sand with Ilya's name in his mouth and the confession ringing off the walls of the arena. He kept his distance, and the court heard it, and the realm heard it, and the specific 20-year silence that had protected Tywin Lannister from the consequences of what he'd ordered was broken. The confession didn't fix anything by itself. A confession is not justice. It's a tool. The tool had to be used. It had to be leveraged, combined with other tools, assembled into a mechanism that could produce the outcome that the confession alone couldn't. The removal of the man who gave the order. Not his death. His removal. Because Oberyn Martell learned something in the arena that he hadn't known before the fight started, that killing the man who did the thing was easier than changing the system that produced the man. Clegane was dead in 3 minutes. The system took 6 weeks. The system fought back. The system had money and allies, and the specific institutional inertia of 20 years of Lannister governance. And the system was harder to kill than the Mountain, because the system didn't have a throat to put a spear through. But the system had a ledger. And the ledger had a key. And the key was money. A Dornishman killed the Mountain. A Tyrell grandmother bought the debt. A Lannister dwarf found the ledger. A Lannister brother chose the realm over the family. And the lion went home. Not in chains, not in disgrace. In the specific Lannister version of defeat that was diminished, reduced, sent to the rock with his daughter and his gold and his legacy, which was now a legacy that included a public confession and a removed handship and the specific historical footnote that Tywin Lannister, the most powerful man in the 7 Kingdoms, was undone not by a sword, but by a spreadsheet. Oberyn sat at the table, not the side table, not the Dornish table, the small council table, the table where decisions were made, where the realm was governed, where the power sat. He sat there, and he thought about Elia, about the sister who had been beautiful and kind, and who had married a prince and had borne him children, and who had been repaid for all of this with murder. About the 20 years of grief that had fueled everything, the rage, the training, the spear, the poison, the arena, the confession, the politics, the 6 weeks of maneuvering that had produced this seat. He thought, Elia would hate this. She hated politics. She hated the game. He thought Elia would also understand, because Elia understood what it cost to be a Martell in a kingdom that didn't respect Dorne, and Elia would understand that the seat was not for Oberyn. The seat was for every Dornish child who would grow up knowing that their people had a voice at the table. He thought, this is not enough. He thought, it's a start. The Red Viper of Dorne, master of laws, sitting at the small council table in the Red Keep of King's Landing with the ghost of his sister beside him and the specific, patient, ongoing project of making the realm into something that deserved to survive. Not justice, not yet. but the seat, the table, the voice, and the knowledge, the bone-deep, blood-bought knowledge, that the distance between almost and did was 3 feet. That patience was not weakness, that the spear and the spreadsheet were both weapons, and the man who could use both was the man who changed the world. 3 feet. That was all it took.